Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Raleigh. I'm the Department Head of Landscape Architecture and Regional and Community Planning. I'd like to welcome you to the third Ekdahl lecture of the semester, given by Sara Zewde. The Oscar S. Ekdahl Distinguished Lecture Series in the College of Architecture, Planning, and Design honors Oscar Ekdahl, who received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Kansas State University in 1933. He was a founding partner in Ekdahl, Davis, Depew, Pearson Architects in Topeka. These lectures bring the finest professionals in the design and planning disciplines to AP Design and our K-State community. They're selected to avail students, faculty, staff, and professionals of the potency of design and planning in addressing the issues we face as a global society. The innovative and inspiring Ekdahl lectures help you envision the work of each of our disciplines, as well as the impact your own work might make. Landscape architecture is so relevant to the issues and concerns of our time, making it a very rewarding field. Landscape architects serve the higher purpose of social and ecological justice for all peoples and all species. We're versed in both environmental and cultural systems, uniquely positioning us to address complex social and ecological problems. And landscape architects bring different and often competing interests together to give form to the ideals of equity, sustainability, resiliency, and democracy. Sara Zewde's practice exemplifies what that looks like. She is at the forefront of contemporary landscape architecture as a landscape designer, urbanist, and public artist. I first learned of Sara's work when she was named the 2014 National Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation. Hearing her speak then about her work, I remember thinking, wow, this woman is going to do important and inspiring work. And is she ever? She is rethinking and re-envisioning the ways we design space, acknowledging lived history in her designs, and creating spaces for everyone. Her vision for landscape architecture is exciting and bold. Sara founded Studio Zewde, based in Harlem, New York City. She holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, a Master's of City Planning from MIT, and a BA in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. Sara has received many distinguished awards. Some of her most recent are being named to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's inaugural 40 Under 40 People Saving Places list in 2018, and currently being honored as a United States Artists Fellow. In addition to her practice, she's an assistant professor of practice at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Sara's going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, sharing her work and her vision. We solicited questions for her during this last week, and at the end of her lecture, Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture, Katie Kingery Page, will join her to serve as moderator to engage Sara in some discussion. So if you haven't done so already, please log into YouTube so you can contribute to the discussion by submitting additional questions or discussion topics to the chat. Katie's going to moderate the chat during the presentation, and she'll share your questions with Sara at the end. So please join me in welcoming Sara Zewde to AP Design and Kansas State. We are so happy and honored to have you with us as an Ekdahl lecture, Sara. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I feel so honored and blessed to have received this invitation and to be in dialogue with you all. I've already shared with some of the faculty that I so lament the fact that I can't be there in person and meet you all face to face and learn about the community that you have there. And I just will be able to look forward to meeting you all in person one day. So thank you for the amazing introduction, and I guess I can jump in from here. Let's see, share my screen. So my journey as a landscape architect started August 29 of 2005. As I watched this storm event brew and barrel towards my home state of Louisiana. And I was watching this from my college dorm in Boston. And it was really the aftermath of this weather event that prompted my journey, my intellectual journey towards finding a discipline that could tackle the really wide range of ecological and political and cultural, aesthetic, infrastructural, factors that can manifest a Hurricane Katrina. And I appreciate the comment in the introduction about the relevance of landscape architecture, because that question ultimately did lead me to find landscape architecture as a discipline that I wanted to engage with. And so my practice, broadly speaking, or what I do, my professional endeavors take a really wide range of forms. But I don't see these as, 6 of these, I'd say I organize them more or less into 6 categories, but they're not parallel endeavors. I try to curate them such that they're, compounding one another, they're feeding on one another. There's a feedback loop that's generative and productive, and they're all bound together really by a few central inquiries about landscape architecture and the built environment. The title of this lecture is called The Aesthetics of Being. And, essentially what this comes from is this idea that it's actually a phrase from a essay that I read by Bell Hooks. And it was kind of a phrase that a throwaway line about how the women in her life growing up, weren't necessarily cognizant of design per se, capital D, but they were engaged in the aesthetic and crafting the aesthetics of their own being. And so, if you are, whoever you are, if you are a Black person, a physically disabled person, a man, a woman, non-binary, if you are poor, if you're a Southerner like me, whoever you are, that, your being may be politicized by others. And so what can the world, the physical realm that we all live in, say or do to support your being, to acknowledge your being, to not only to acknowledge it, but to foster it, to support your growth and your ability to be alive? What is that aesthetic? And how can we as designers learn the language of designing and building for it? So this is the kind of thing that we think about in a real way in the practice of landscape architecture in our office. So the way we describe this is that Studio Zewde's design methodology is powered by site interpretation and cultural narrative, and a dedication to the craft of construction. So this language that I'm using to describe the kind of, sort of philosophical framework for what we do is something that doesn't just end at the beginning of projects, that we use this belief that in the aesthetics of being, to actually make decisions all the way through to construction. In other words, how can a narrative, a cultural narrative, help you shape a material hierarchy, or decide how to turn a corner with the material, or detail, or spec, or whatever it is. But the finished physical expression of space is what ultimately makes people feel like they belong in this world or not. And so these ideas, we feel, are important throughout every phase of the design process. And so our work takes on a really wide range of scales and typologies and geographies all across the United States. And it's really this idea and methodology of the aesthetics of being that allow us to work in all of these different contexts and evolve and change and scrap and revision the way that we do what we do. So we're always reflecting and learning as the kind of work we do diversifies. So I'll just take you through a few projects, both in Studio Zewde, but also some of my research, to give you a sense of how these pieces fit together. This is a small project that I actually did while I was working for another firm in Houston, Texas. This is a street called Genesee Street in Freedman's Town, a neighborhood in Houston, Texas. that was built by freed slaves after emancipation. And so they built their own homes. They made their own bricks to pave their own streets. They built their own sewer system, their own schools, all things that the city of Houston would not afford them. They settled along the Buffalo Bayou and cleared the land, this really clay, prone to flooding, really thickly vegetated part of the bayou that at the time nobody wanted, despite its proximity to downtown. So here's downtown, and this is the space that we're actually talking about. And one of the things they did when they settled this part of the Buffalo Bayou was they actually kept some of the lots undeveloped so that it could do two things. One is hold water, mitigate flooding. And the other was they felt like they could also use that for spaces of gathering, primarily for worship. So they constructed, using branches from the bayou, they constructed these brush arbors. And so this was a part of their basically urban stormwater strategy, stormwater management strategy in the neighborhood. This neighborhood went on to become the civic heart of Black Houston, home to shop owners, teachers, and lawyers. But over the decades, the neighborhood fell victim to a number of things that are very common in historic communities that are near the urban core. Urban renewal, the bisecting of the neighborhood with the freeway, the removal of housing to put public housing, and now the really fierce development pressure due to its proximity to downtown. So the firm I was working for was hired but they were subcontracted to a civil engineering firm that was upgrading the sewer system on this street, Genesee Street. It's a 60-foot wide right-of-way. On the left, you see the historic grid, and on the right, you see how a number of the blocks have already been removed over the years due to urban renewal. And so the engineers, they asked us, they're thinking we're, landscape architects, they just said, just tell us where to put the curbs, and you're going to put trees 30 foot on center, right? Maybe you want to put a plaque to tell the story of the neighborhood, or they're like, oh, maybe you can put African paving in the symbols, in the streets rather. And what we said was, this is actually an opportunity to go a little bit further than that. And so I started by really looking at the architecture that the original settlers built, and found that it actually can be traced back to West Africa, the Yoruba ethnic group in current day Nigeria. And that architecture was actually brought to Haiti during the transatlantic slave trade. And then during the Haitian Revolution, like 1799, 1801, a lot of people fled Haiti and fled to New Orleans. And from there, this architectural typology spread through the bayous of Southeast Texas. And so, one of the things about this architectural type is that with the short end of the home facing the street, there's actually, a higher number of units facing the street and a lot of social activation of the street. And these sort of porches, there's this gallery created by the ubiquity of the porch and the alignment of the setbacks. And, this liminal space that's not really private, but not really public, is really central to people's memories of this place and all the social interactions and what people really have loved about this place. So I went out and while some of the structures still remain, took note of the kind of patterns created by the stairs, the porches, the windows and doors, even the paving that the original settlers laid. You can see there's a sort of orthogonal pattern along the straightaway of the roads, but at the intersections, that pattern breaks and forms this diagonal. And the elders in the neighborhood say that the settlers did this on purpose to mark the intersection as a space of ritual, and that this is a tradition from West Africa. So I proposed congregating the salvageable bricks in the intersections to elevate the presence of the intersections. And where we were tasked with putting a site wall, instead of a site wall, I proposed essentializing the dimensions of this architectural type and using that to kind of tell the story of the architecture and of this place. So this is a simulation that I did of the patterns in shadow that would be cast by these cutout windows and doors. And I proposed casting these concrete walls with the actual wood panels from the structures that are being removed, so that the walls themselves are sort of representative of the grain of the original structures. And instead of, just picking some off-the-shelf site furnishings, the idea of offering seating was actually integrated into the wall and integrated into the storytelling, this being such an essential part of the history of the neighborhood. And even the planting palette itself really spoke to the original, bayou vegetation that the settlers worked to clear. After having seen what we were doing, the school district that owned this property offered the opportunity to us to expand this concept into their property, an area that we called the sanctuary. And here we were able to, because it wasn't a public right-of-way, we were able to propose actually a curbless road profile with some bioswales to speak to that history that the original settlers held properties, held open land for both mitigating flooding, but also for gathering. And so we proposed a sort of brush arbor, space where folks who've been displaced from the neighborhood can actually come back and have a space to be and to gather. I mean, this project is really it's a streetscape project. It uses all of the sort of mundane media of landscape architecture, planting, paving, lighting, site furnishings and site walls. But each element that forms our media as landscape architects is a method or a tool. It's an opportunity to tell a story. And what stories are we choosing to tell with those media? And what are we not telling? So this is another project in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that we were commissioned by the Fairmount Park Conservancy to do in 2018. So this is a part of the larger Fairmount Park system in Philadelphia. We were tasked with coming up with a landscape plan for the 22-acre site that is adjacent to the Strawberry Mansion community in North Philadelphia. So Strawberry Mansion is a neighborhood that's seen a lot of disinvestment, a lot of vacancy. The high school there is considered the most violent high school in the United States. The community is wonderful, the people are amazing, and this park represents so much to people's everyday lives. Everybody talks about how their first kiss was here, and a lot of the sports programming offers this really incredible intergenerational relationship building and mentoring. And so this place means a lot to a lot of people, but the physical conditions of the existing site do not match what this place means to people. So we saw our task coming in to elevate the physical conditions, the physical realm, to match what the significance is for the people here. Our work usually starts with a lot of archival research, and it also helps people open up to the process and tell us about their connection to places that we're working in. So these images, just started our process of working with people and brought smiles to people's faces and really allowed them to engage us initially in the project. One of the residents gave us this poem, and I'll read a couple of lines from it. It says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" This was a poem that was written in 1952 for Joseph Mander, who was a resident of the neighborhood. And that this idea of a monument that breathes then really became the creative departure for our process here. Before we started doing anything, before we had drawn anything, we wanted to have a community engagement event. So we actually never have community meetings. We only call them events. And that just allows us to crack open the format of what it can be. So this was, we decided to have a block party. We heard that the people in the neighborhood have a lot of block parties. So we said, we're gonna have a block party and we're gonna celebrate the park just the way it is before we even talk about changing it, knowing how much people love it. So we had t-shirt making and I Love Mander. It was an I Love Mander block party. There were all these prompts where people could, talk about what they love about the place. We had barbecue and DJs and rappers and poets, and it also was a site analysis tool for us. We got to see the place very activated and get a better sense of what people are drawn to and how they use the place. So at a certain point in the block party, we switched out the barbecue for aerial maps, and we had the 150 participants or party goers to break up into 6 groups and come up with collective collages about what they love about Mander. And then those 6 groups then presented to the larger group about what their vision was. And, you know, it was really productive for us to just hear how people are articulating the place to and for themselves. Instead of, you know, it being like the designers and then the community members. It was really a collective, everyone engaging with one another. So then we took the 6 collages and did sort of an interpretation to figure out what are the emerging themes here. Not looking at this as a one-for-one, you know, oh, somebody put plants and flowers here, there should be a garden here. Rather, what are the large strokes? What are the sort of gestures and orientations that are important here? And we were able to kind of cull that down into 3 main design guidelines for ourselves. One was activating 33rd Street, this sort of residential edge, all the way to the north. Second was bringing people into the campus. And third was forming a clear and legible circulation system. And so we were able to then take those 3 design guidelines and really very clearly articulate how they actually shape the physical landscape design. And that was really useful for people to you know, stay engaged in the process, being able to reflect back to them very clearly how their input translates into a physical design. That included the development of what we called a memory plan. So all the memories that we heard people share with us, their favorite memories, we were able to, you know, basically convey very clearly how this design is, you know, not only about keeping those memories there, but fortifying, strengthening the continuation of those memories into the future. This is about anchoring people in this community moving forward. So John Coltrane is from this neighborhood, and on the left is a sketch that he did of the mathematics of jazz music. So we took that sketch and translated it into a paving pattern, and which become an armature for inscriptions about people from the neighborhood, other notable people, as well as wayfinding throughout the entirety of the park. Family reunions are really big in the park, and so we had a whole grove dedicated to that, including Meek Mill in this rendering, who's a rapper from the neighborhood. And in the heart of this sort of social heart of the park, at the southeast corner, we proposed a water feature with the words of the poem about the breathing monument inscribed below the water, so that as you're looking out into this topographic kind of bowl that really hugs the sports and picnic fields, that as you're looking out into this vista, that you're reflecting on the fact that the breathing monument is actually, you know, the community itself. Another project in Philadelphia, this is on the Delaware River on the east side, is Graffiti Pier. This is a 6-acre waterfront project. It includes Pier 18 as well as Pier 20. So you see Pier 20 kind of falling into the water here, and then Pier 18, and then we also have some of the upland area in our 6-acre site. So again, our sort of process really started here with a deep research into the history of the site. And what we found was that the history of coal in Pennsylvania is such that, you know, its decline began in the 1970s, and that coincides with the invention of graffiti in the 1970s, which was invented actually in Philadelphia. And so when those 2 things happened at the same time, this site became a really important part in graffiti culture, a place for people to come and make art. And in 2010, when Instagram happened, it became it kind of rose from its underground status, and more people started to come, and now it's the most Instagrammed spot in Philadelphia. So that became a liability issue for the railroad company who owns the site. And so we were commissioned by the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation to develop a landscape plan for, you know, how to make this potentially public place. The site is incredibly beautiful. It's a very dynamic outdoor street art museum that's different every time you go. And, you know, the graffiti writers, when they heard that there was this interest to make it a public place, were really concerned, because the ecosystem of graffiti is very sensitive. It thrives on this transgression and anonymity. And so what we pitched as our process to the client was that, okay, generally public engagement is supposed to be really public, but we will have two arms of our engagement strategy. One that is public, that engages adjacent residents. The other would be discreet and underground. And we would actually tap into the underground network of graffiti writers and, really honor the fact that graffiti writing is about anonymity, because people are criminalized for their use of the site. They have day jobs and government names. And so we just started meeting with them in bars and, talking to representatives of people and getting anonymous phone calls and emails. One of the things we communicated very early to the graffiti writers is that within a 30-year time frame, the site will be inundated from rising tides, just in terms of daily high tide, not in a storm event even. And so making this a public space or generating public investment is actually the only chance Graffiti Pier has at survival. So it's not about, saying like, we don't want this to be public. It's about leveraging this opportunity to save Graffiti Pier. There's pressure from the sea. There's also pressure from the land, because urban development pressures are encroaching from the land side. So those initial conversations, this is one of the bars that we met graffiti writers at, we're really communicating that to them and letting them know this is their process to guide and to take hold of. And so every time we met with someone, we asked them the same question. We asked, what is the best thing that can happen at Graffiti Pier, and what is the worst thing that can happen? And we charted all the responses that we got on the spectrum of untouched and new park. And so you can see that for the most part, everyone says the best thing that can happen here is that it's untouched, and the worst thing is that it feels new. So we took the emerging themes from those conversations, and similar to Mander, we said, okay, here are the 4 guidelines for us. We came back to the graffiti writers and said, this is what's going to guide us. This is your input. This is how we've analyzed your input, and here's how we're going to move forward. 1, ensuring the continuation and expansion of art. 2, keeping the site vegetated and passive. 3, making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible. And 4 is keeping it gritty. And so again, we were able to reflect back to the graffiti writers and to the residents how, at a site diagram scale, how each one of those guidelines was being interpreted into the plan. So ensuring the continuation, expansion of art, we're keeping all of the columns and the structures that people continue to make art. We're adding, through regrading and retaining walls and the introduction of new art follies and surfaces and seawalls, we're actually expanding art on the site. We're keeping the site vegetated and passive. We're not introducing dog parks or playgrounds. This is meant to feel like a place that feels found. It's not a park per se with all of the tropes of a park. Safety and accessibility. So again, we regraded the path, or we're proposing to regrade the paths to make them accessible, upgrading the surfacing also to meet accessibility requirements. We're also integrating an accessible ramp to the top of one of the structures, because people climb up there right now and get incredible views of the city from there. So we are introducing an accessible ramp, and then keeping it gritty. When we asked the graffiti writers, so what does it mean what is the grit? What do you mean by gritty? And the elements that they proposed were landscape elements. They said, like mud and like water and rocks and plants, and so we interpreted that. I mean, that kind of gritty ecosystem is very much supportive of this waterfront landscape. And so we actually proposed removing the bulkheads and regrading the slope to introduce an intertidal landscape into the site, which would help buffer the site both from the pressures from climate change, but also introduce a visual buffer that really hugs Graffiti Pier and blocks out the urban development that's already under construction adjacent to the site and is projected to come on the other sides. And so after having developed some of these ideas, we took some early renderings back to the graffiti writers, and they actually graffiti tagged their feedback onto the renderings themselves. And so we decoded this writing to take us into the next phase of design. And so, what you see here is kind of how we've translated, keeping the character of the existing site, but introducing things like a bioretention swale or new art follies and the sort of integration of the art with the landscape. So this is a section through Pier 18. We're introducing, a more robust plant palette that speaks spatially to what's there now, but is a more sustainable planting palette. And so this influences things like site furnishings. We did some design studies for, custom furnishings that would appear to be part of the industrial history of the site, or, look like artists brought chairs out from their studio. But really are more additional surfaces for graffiti writing and street art. So to give you a sense of what this looks like hitting the ground, this is before and this is after. So this is with the integration of bioswale and upgraded surfacing. This is before between two structures. So we're introducing shade, trees, again, a more robust planting palette, and then our site furnishings. This is before, looking down to the edge of Pier 18. And this is after. This is at the top of, as I mentioned, people climb up here now. These railings are not to code. It's very dangerous to climb up here. One of the things that we heard from many people, graffiti writers and residents alike, was don't make this like the High Line. We don't want lush planting. We don't want it to look manicured. And so we proposed sedums and grasses here. We figured out a way to bring these railings to code. And you see here, how we're integrating an accessible ramp into the structure and into the language as if it was always there. So this is a smaller project, a fun one, in Seattle, Washington, for a neighborhood called Africatown. So this neighborhood in the 1970s was over 70% Black, and now it's 12%. And that's due to a lot of the pressure, development pressure from Microsoft and Amazon and Starbucks and all of that. And so the generation that grew up to witness the, dismantling of the neighborhood, they're in their mid 40s, late 40s. They came together to form a community land trust. And they said, the adjacent neighborhood, Chinatown, is not being displaced. And perhaps part of the reason why is because the name of the neighborhood itself says the history, tells something about the history. And so this neighborhood has been called the Central District for many years, and they decided to recast themselves as Africatown. And so we were commissioned to do design ciphers. So this is a take on the idea of the design charrette, but couch it within hip hop culture. And so the cipher is something that is a culture where, you're on the kind of street corner and people are rapping off the top of their head, and you have to listen and pay attention and be on your feet and contribute at any time. And so we took that concept and formed a sort of collaborative design space around that idea. One of the projects that came from these design ciphers is a public art project. This is a sign that you would see kind of every day in the Central District where there's new development. There's a Porsche and a jogger and a dog, and this doesn't look like the Central District most people know. So we made our own. We made our own fake coming soon signs with the imagery that was generated from the design ciphers. And so if you're walking around the Central District in 2018, you would have seen these signs all over the place. These logos are all fake companies that would have to be built in order to build this future Africatown. So Roots Landscape Architecture, I think there's like Obelisk Engineering, Africatown Developers. And the only place where this kind of matrix is pierced through, you go to the website and, the fiction continues until you go to the events or the meetings panel, and meetings would take you to actual meetings for the Africatown Community Land Trust. But it was really fun hanging around these signs and just hearing people, be like, oh my gosh, is this going to happen? And I would just be like, yeah, it kind of looks like it. So this was really fun. And what it did was really mobilize people and generate excitement around the idea of building, a community, a neighborhood into the future, a chapter after gentrification. Another project that came from the design ciphers was an activation of this parking lot. So this parking lot is considered the ground zero of gentrification. And the Africatown Community Land Trust purchased this property, not just the parking lot, but also this the existing structures, which have actual retail tenants in them. And, you know, they didn't have the financing to redevelop the project yet. They had plans to, but they had an activation. They had enough to activate it. They wanted us to come up with something short term that could just generate excitement again. So with 30,000 square feet to cover, we knew paint was going to be our best friend, and we really worked at the design side first to come up with the design. Part of what came out of that was people really wanted to use concrete as a material, which is not a material you would think of for a temporary project. But there was a sentiment that people wanted to, quote, concretize their presence in Seattle. This corner, the corner of 23rd and Union, is considered the intersection from where more Black men have been incarcerated for possession of marijuana than any other place in the city. And it's ironic now that marijuana is legal that across the street a marijuana dispensary is open. So there was some feeling of wanting to take back that corner. And so we developed this idea of a concrete outdoor living room at the corner. Again, anchoring people, this idea of being, the aesthetic of being on that corner. And you know, we worked with formerly incarcerated and homeless men from the neighborhood who had never worked with concrete before, but they learned this skill, they gained this skill, they were actually quite good, and they've gone on to do other small landscape installation projects around the neighborhood. We had over 300 people from the neighborhood come out and help paint the installation, which was a really fun weekend of music and food. So many cute kids painting. It's like so hard to narrow this down to a few pictures. But you know, it's still a parking lot, still a functioning parking lot. I like to think of this as the most beautiful post office parking lot I've ever seen. This is mid-installation of the outdoor living room. Got some plants in there. The mayor came out for a red ribbon cutting. So this is before, this is after. This is the first day of the opening. We had a huge potluck called the Reunion on Union. We brought people back from the areas where they've been displaced to, and came back to enjoy the opening of the parking lot installation. This is the corner, 23rd and Union before, and this is after. So you see the community coffee table here. People actually submitted their favorite historic images of the neighborhood, and we epoxied that onto the top of this coffee table. And the site's gone on to kind of have a life of its own, with programming and so forth. So I'll end with one more project. This is a research project that's ongoing, a book that I'm writing about Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and the years of his biography that I feel are underrepresented in the way that we historicize his legacy in landscape architecture. So in his early 30s, starting in 1852, Frederick Law Olmsted was hired by what was then known as the New York Daily Times, but is now the New York Times, to travel the slave states and write about the conditions of slavery. And when we talk about the history of Olmsted, we often talk about how you know, he was a journalist and he had some other interests and other careers that he had before landscape architecture. This is sort of a timeline of those activities that we understand as having been before he was a landscape architect. And then we talk about, the history of landscape architecture and his founding of the profession. And we, his being appointed superintendent of Central Park, and then going on to, with Vaux establishing a firm and working across the country until he retires. The reality is, though, if we look at these things in their chronology, he was doing both at the same time and going back and forth. And my sort of hypothesis that I started this research project kind of endeavoring to understand more was the relationship between his journeys across the South and being an abolitionist and activist, and his work and practice as a landscape architect. I found I couldn't find that much about the relationship between the two, and that really started my research a couple of years ago. It's notable then also to understand the founding of our profession within a very specific historical context, a very profound moment in the history of the United States. And it's prompted me, living in the moment that we all live in now, to think about landscape architecture today and what it means, what Olmsted thought this profession could mean in his time and what we can think about it meaning today. So he, after having written in the New York Daily Times, he goes on to work, on Central Park, and he actually steps down from his position at Central Park to rewrite his original articles into a singular volume called Cotton Kingdom. And in this volume, this is 10 years later, so this is 1861 or 9 years later, he rewrites with a very staunchly abolitionist view. And so after having seen everything that he saw and reflecting, he becomes less apologetic about his beliefs. And in fact, part of the reason why he stepped down from his position at Central Park to rewrite this was because he felt a civil war may break out, and he wanted to be able to publish this in advance of a civil war. I had the privilege of spending 4 months at Dumbarton Oaks, going through his personal letters, and actually spent a few months last year retracing his steps through the South. This is actually a really important drawing that he himself made with Daniel Goodloe, using 1860 census data. What he wanted to do, so this is a technique that we all know today as, kind of GIS spatial analysis. But what he wanted to do with this drawing and with his writing was to basically challenge the economic argument for slavery. He found that in places where there were larger concentrations of enslaved people, that the economies weren't actually doing that well, and that innovation and culture, civic culture, which he was very concerned about, was actually corroded by the idea of enslaving people. And so, having visited the sites that he describes and the range of conditions I found them in, there were a number of reflections that these sites prompted for me. I mean, for one, I found that in almost every case, the physical conditions of what Olmsted documented in terms of the enslavement of people, the physical conditions, any trace of that having happened as vividly as he describes, is nowhere in the physical landscape. And in many cases, it's landscape architecture that was the tool to erase or recast or build on top of those histories. And so it's kind of an ironic twist of fate that this profession that he would advocate so hardly for would go on to untell the stories that he wanted to tell about this country. And while the physical conditions have been manipulated, the social and the economic conditions that he describes are still very present today. And so, I'm kind of still working on, I'm still working on, on these sort of like reflecting on these conclusions. But I think what this work is starting to really do is bring to the forefront about, the questions that we're all grappling with today, which are primarily, what can we do as landscape architects in such a pivotal moment in our own history as a country. And so to look back 165 years and to suggest that there may be some clues in the actual founding of our profession, that the roots of our profession were founded on the idea that our profession is one about advocacy. It's one about, the sort of macro understanding of the society and being able to toggle back and forth between macro level readings of the society and the sort of small scale readings of a landscape. This ability to be able to work at the site scale and understand its context is endemic to the profession if we accept Olmsted as the father. And I think is a methodological proposition for how we might practice landscape architecture today. So that I'll leave it there, and I thank you for the privilege of your time, and I hope you will engage me in a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sara. I am right now going to spotlight both of us if you'd like to stop sharing, and I'll begin to pose some of the questions that have been coming in. Let's see if I can get this right. Okay, excellent. Zoom comes up with new tricks every day. That was a fantastic lecture. Thank you so much. We have several questions that have come in through the chat, but I'm actually going to start with one that was posed ahead of time by our lectures committee, who was very familiar with your work. And here it is. Your projects often involve stepping into discomfort, whether it's into the history of lived experiences of enslaved people, whether it's into the fear of community loss or working with communities who may have dealt with decades of erasure. What would you share with young designers about working with and through discomfort?
That's a really wonderful question. Yeah, a lot of the sites that we're working in are sites of contested narratives, are very highly charged sites. You'll notice that the way that I present those sites are very kind of matter of fact, and that is somewhat on purpose. And even Olmsted, as he's describing the sites and the scenes that he's witnessing, is very matter of fact. And I think with everything being so charged, that especially if you in your own daily life you're confronted with the implications of, for instance, of slavery or other trauma, if that's part of your everyday life, there is a sort of matter of factness that you have to approach these things with just to survive. You can't be emotional every day. You're not afforded that luxury. And in fact, I think for people, who want that kind of rage, want to experience, that sort of emotion, I think it's somewhat because they want to relieve their own guilt. And so I don't feel the need to engage, to let myself go in terms of being very emotional. It's more about survival, I guess, for me. And so there is a sort of like, I know the work that needs to be done. I know the scale of things, the scale of trauma and, things that we have to overcome as a society. And so there's, I think, a productive way to approach it. That's kind of how I do. It's not for everyone, but for me personally, that's how my process works.
Thank you. And although certainly not all the emotions that you're engaging with in design are ebullient or joyful, I want to ask you a really quick question about the aesthetics of being. I find this to be a wonderful title for your talk. It's fantastic. And as you talked about the Africa Town project, also the living room project I'm aware of that you've done in Seattle in an alley, these both seem to me so tied to that aesthetics of being, because where else are we really being but in a living room? Could you reflect a little further on that and what that means in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, the living room is literally called the room for living, and we kind of take that for granted. The living room project was a one-day installation in an alley that's infamous for drug use and homelessness, and we made an outdoor living room, and we're curious about how we could actually pierce through this sort of parallel lives that people that live inside and people that live outside engage in without thinking about. And but yeah, it's this, the larger idea is that the landscape architects, we shape space. We shape everyday life, and it's such a profound responsibility. And when you think about, for instance, the issue of police violence has, been taken sort of national stage right now. And most of those people who were killed by police were in public space, in landscapes that we designed. And there's a question about, how the built environment either can elevate your presence, dignify your presence, make you feel, not just make you feel, but really be supportive of your life. Like that corner of 23rd and Union in the Africa Town project. If there was a outdoor living room on that corner, why wouldn't there be men sitting there and enjoying their lives? And why isn't that okay? So, I mean, it's a phrase that becomes operative in a lot of different ways in every project. It's different.
Thank you. I'm going to move into some of the questions that were being posed on YouTube in the chat. And this one, Sara, this probably exemplifies why we would love to have you at K-State with us. This came from one of our colleagues in landscape architecture, LaBarbara James Wigfall, who herself is a scholar of Black settlements in America. And her question is, first, have you looked at other landscape patterns from West Africa that influenced Houston's Freedmanstown? And she's talking about walls and hedge combinations, as well as other material details, including brick, which you did reference in the streetscape. I think she has a scholar to scholar question for you.
Ooh, it sounds like you have more references that I don't know of, and I'd love to learn more.
Wonderful. And she had a follow-up, I think actually a couple of follow-up process questions. The process to integrate historic cultural patterns into proposed design. Could you share, for the benefit of our students and for all of us, how you think about that? Obviously not everything can be included. So how do you go about thinking of what comes in and what is represented and what's alluded to?
It's a great question. I mean, patterns is definitely a concept that we use a lot. I mean, you know, when you're drawing from traditions that are less represented in the built environment, then patterns of use become really important to the process. So, you know, like Mander, we did the collaging, but there's another layer of analysis of just observation that we do too. And so observing actually the physical uses of space and you know, and patterns really becomes the way to then interpret that data. You know, I feel like the use of space is a design act in and of itself. You know, taking back the street corner and using a sidewalk, not just for movement, but as an actual space, or the porch and making it a space of gathering. I mean, those uses that humans make with their bodies, those are traces, those are patterns that that we can pull from. And so it's great when there are really clear you know, inheritances, cultural inheritances in the built environment, but there are many traditions where it's just not as clear. And so the act of observation, and maybe this is where my sociology background kicks in, but there are a lot of sociological methods that can be used for, you know, interpreting that observational data.
Well, that is a great bridge to this question posed by one of our students in planning. Abby, what factors do you consider when choosing community engagement strategies for different projects and different groups of people? And I think, Sara, you've already been reflecting on this with some of the ethnographic and sociological perspectives that you're bringing to your work. So that's a great
question. These are all great questions. So yeah, we never use the same community engagement method twice. We feel like the format of engagement is a design project in and of itself. And so the question becomes, you know, understanding the community and what its rhythms are. So for instance, in Mander, we know that block parties are a big thing, and we just, you know, looped ourselves into the schedule of block parties. And graffiti, in graffiti, we learned that, you know, the culture of graffiti is very anonymous and discreet, and we looped into that, jumped into that, and had all these discrete meetings. And so it's really about tapping into the rhythms of the way the place works already, and, you know, not forcing or introducing something new to that, but really like, how do you make it easy for it to just lace into the place, and much like your design might. And understanding, you know, one of the other things we do is we never ask people what they want. Like, oh, what do you want here? What do you want in your park? We never ask that, because the reality is we can't give it to them. What we do instead is ask, you know, these larger questions. You know, what do you love about this place? What is your favorite memory? Or what is the best thing that can happen here? So that we're putting ourselves in a position of not just making a laundry list of things the park needs to include, but rather, you know, setting up parameters and a framework, and that puts us in the position of being interpreters of that information. There's some looseness and that allows us to still make something that's resonant, but not like, well, you know, I said 4 bathrooms and not 3, you know, that kind of thing.
That's great. I love how that leaves it open-ended for the expertise of the designer to be part of that process. Let me move to this question here from Susan. Oh, and I should say quickly too, you're getting a whole lot of compliments and wonderful, love your lecture, love the graphics. I don't want to overlook those things. I'll read just one from La Barbara. Sara, these are amazing projects that speak to the need for cultural interpretation by professionals. That's one comment here. And now a question from Susan. How have your designs evolved over the years that they have been in place in neighborhoods? Have they fulfilled the purpose they were created to fulfill, or did neighborhoods change them in different ways?
That's a great question. Maybe ask me that in 10 years, because I feel like it hasn't been long enough. We're just getting started. You know, the first project was really installed, let's see, 1.5 years ago. So it's too new. I feel like it's not a fair question, but this is something that I will continue to keep in mind. I'm curious to find out too. And 10 years from now, when you guys invite me back and to do this in person, maybe, I would love to be asked that question again and have the answer for you, but I don't know yet. We'll see.
Perfect. And a related question, this one is from Castasia. Have you done any post-occupancy evaluation of past projects to assess how these projects impact the quality of life? Again, it might be a little too early, but please tell us what you think, and maybe you have plans to do those kind of things.
We do. I mean, we haven't been commissioned to do them, but certainly, I mean, right now, especially right now with us working virtually, we're actually spread out. My managing principals in Seattle now, and we have some in Chicago. And so the upside is that we have somebody near all of our projects, and we have a different relationship now to the sites because we can go see them very frequently, which was ironically not the case before when we were all located in New York. So we haven't done any formal post-occupancy evals, but certainly, you know, informally, it's an important part of us growing and understanding and reflecting on what we do.
And now you're embedded in all those places, as you said. So
yeah.
Here's a question posed by Dean DeNoble. When working with constituencies, how do you engender a sense of continued engagement in the stewardship of the environments, getting past a certain point in time? And he has sort of a follow-up here. Obviously, the transformative palette of the pure works this way, but he's wondering how the sense of ownership and stewardship works on the other projects, all of which are beautiful and provocative.
Yeah. So, you know, a big part of the work that we do, and it's not actually reflected in the presentation, is that we have throughout the process, usually we have some form of an advisory council that, you know, because of this idea of continued engagement. The reality is we are not community members, nor can we really be. And so there is community engagement, but there's another level of you know, holding a stake in the process that we offer through an advisory council format. And so, for instance, we have graffiti writers on this advisory council for Graffiti Pier, and they have brought, you know, elements to the project that we would not have brought. For instance, a curatorial panel, or you know, some sort of like rules and regulations, and just the sort of operation and maintenance of the place. And so those kinds of considerations that we wouldn't have, that are important to the long-term continued success of these places, you know, we're continually being guided for designing in support of that through an advisory council that we meet with regularly throughout the entire process. So they help us design the engagement formats. They help review the design work alongside the client to make sure that it's in keeping with, you know, what will work over the long run. And so even when our clients don't necessarily have that in mind, we've been able to propose that and implement that, and that's been really central to our process.
Excellent. That brings us to a related question. Planners often talk about stakeholders. Ethnographers might talk about informants. How do you, in your process, go about figuring out who are those right people? Who needs to be on our advisory board? Who do we need to bring to the table?
So really, these are like the best questions I've probably ever gotten. So shout out to K-State. This is a very, very, very important part of the process. And our project kickoff phases, like whenever we chart out our project timelines, we leave a lot of time for the phase that we kind of call project kickoff. And that includes things that maybe most typical landscape firms wouldn't include, which is we're doing like social media reviews of like who are the like influencers in the neighborhood. We're in the Facebook groups for the neighborhood. We're tracking like who, we're having conversations with people, calling people, cold calling to get a read of just the kind of undercurrents of a place, socially speaking. And that starts to clue us into who we should be talking to, and then ultimately who's on the advisory council and so on and so forth. But there's a whole process of understanding, the landscape of a place in not just physical terms, but also in social ones. That's an important part. It's embedded in our project process, and it shapes really. If you invest in that early, it shapes the rest of the process in really profound ways.
And this seems so connected to your background in sociology and statistics. I noted today. And I had the pleasure of listening to an LAF interview that you gave, which was very much about your path into landscape architecture and why landscape architecture. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your own path? I think for students, this is always just fascinating to hear, how does someone get to where they are?
It's so funny because it's never really a straight line for landscape architecture. Architects, like, they all knew they wanted to be architects when they were 6, and the landscape architects, like, scenic route. Frankly, I didn't know landscape architecture even existed until relatively recently. And so, I knew I wanted to be involved in cities or urbanism, and that was why I did urban sociology and statistics. And then I thought, okay, cities, I must want to be a city planner. So I did a city planning degree, and I worked in city planning. I worked as a transportation planner in New Orleans and then in Rio. And I just felt, even having started a career in planning, that there was another level of shaping space that was important. I didn't want to write reports. I didn't want to just draw a circle and say, a park goes here. I really was interested in being able to detail a place and figure out its material expression, because I felt like people that are interested in big ideas and sociology and the sort of the large readings of a society often don't take those readings of a place and then think about a joint, or there's a scale at which they feel like those things are no longer relevant. And I just thought to myself, but what if they were? What if we took these big ideas and took them all the way? How would that change the physical realm? And that's the question, I guess. That's somewhat what Olmsted's question was too. And only in hindsight did I learn that about Olmsted. And that's kind of what keeps me going now, is trying to figure that out.
So you referenced that in your talk, Sara, the idea of a macro reading of a society or a culture, really looking at the bigger concepts. And I hate to just say problems, because it's more than problems, but the macro reading, and then being able to bring it all the way down to the site level. So tell us more how you think of this. How do you lead your team to do this?
Mm-hmm. Well, thankfully, everybody that we work with also is interested. It's kind of a self-selecting group of people that want to work here. But yeah, what other field can do that? I just feel like as landscape architects, we have this incredible skill set that's so wide-ranging, and I think when I look back at Olmsted Senior, and then I think about the profession in the intervening year, 165 years, I feel like there was, especially from senior to junior, there was this transition away from what Olmsted Senior saw as like, he really kept in mind these wider range of considerations about landscapes. And then over the years, we kind of fell into more of like, we're technicians. We're technicians that perform services for a fee, and that's what we do, and we fit within our limits of work and the site boundaries, and that's it. But I think we're capable, and the intro, I think, actually affirmed this too. But I think our skill set offers us so much more. And in fact, I think there's a danger when we don't consider the wider range of implications that, the power that we wield can be used for negative. And it has, in fact, urban planners and architects and landscape architects, we have caused a lot of trauma in cities and landscapes in the environment over decades. And so I think those skills are important for us to be able to leverage the power we have and make some good.
Great. I'm seeing that there's 2 more student questions that have come in that I didn't see right away. So in the time we have, I think we could take them. The first one is, how has your engagement with communities that you serve in current projects, how has that been impacted by the global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic? How have your practices had to shift or change?
Well, engagement has definitely shifted. For one, actually, it's led to some interesting innovations. For the Graffiti Pier project, we worked with the graffiti writers to make a zine. A zine is like, a street art publication that's already part of their culture. So we made one with them, and they put their graffiti writing in it. We put our landscape drawings in it, and we mailed them. We mailed them like 3 each, and then they mailed a couple to their networks. And that's how we got the word out about the end of the concept design phase. And that would not have been, that's not how we would have done it. But it ended up offering us a way to innovate, which was fun. But beyond engagement, I think there's a couple of things happening. One is there's a very clear highlighting of the significance of public landscapes. I live in Manhattan, in Harlem, steps away from Central Park, and Central Park has become, a field hospital. It's become a space of, for mental health. It's an infrastructure. It's not just a place to walk around in, or take a carriage, as it were, in the 19th century, but it's an actual infrastructural part of the city, and investment should be made in it as such. We don't build 840-acre parks anymore, but maybe we should. And that's, I think, part of what the pandemic brings to our attention. Another thing that's coming up a lot is development is just not happening as rapidly and fiercely, and it is giving an opportunity to communities who were facing a lot of displacement, a moment to kind of take stock of the situation, regroup, plan, strategize. They didn't have this time to do that. And so this kind of like slow down a little bit in development is a moment of opportunity. And so in places where we're working more in an urban planning realm and thinking about economic development, it's actually giving them the time and space to think more about how they can, take more control of their future and their land.
Fascinating. The next question is from another student of ours, Haley, and she's asking, and maybe this relates to some of those communities that have had a moment to pause and kind of regain their time to challenge development pressures. She's asking, in your own working process, what challenges have you encountered in building rapport and gaining trust with a new community? And this circles back to our earlier question too, a bit about how do you go about identifying and inviting community members. But really, I think the heart of her question is this trust building. Maybe I should reframe it to say, have you encountered a situation where there wasn't trust, where you were entering the realm of design as an outsider? And how did you handle that?
Yeah, we're always outsiders, and I encourage you young designers to own that, to never feel like, well, I'm not from this community, or I'm not this, I'm not that, therefore I can't speak to this, or I don't think that that's how, I believe in design enough to that you can learn and operate and contribute something meaningful if you do it right. And so don't be afraid of being an outsider, and don't be afraid of being yelled at, because that's gonna be a big part of what you do. You're gonna be yelled at, and you just gotta let it roll off of you. And we've all been yelled at, and it's totally fine. Because you have to also, you don't have to, but I recommend that you understand where that anger comes from. It's because there's decades, hundreds of years, frankly, of distrust, and you just have to remind yourself of where it comes from and acknowledge that, even in that moment, that's what that is, and it's warranted. That anger is warranted. That mistrust is warranted. So what I think, trust doesn't come in the beginning of the project. It comes over time, and nobody's going to trust you in the beginning. If you're working, especially in places like we work, it takes a lot of time. And once they see your dedication and your responsiveness, the key really is not just dedication, but responsiveness to their feedback. That's how you slowly gain it. There's this one moment in the Mander project that was really important for me to understand this. The last event that we had, where we actually shared the landscape plan that I shared with you, there was a guy in the back of the room, and he was like, it was actually about bathrooms. He was like, those bathrooms aren't big enough, and da-da-da. And I was about to say something. I was in the front with a mic, and this woman in the second row, she gets up and she's like, Daryl, now you haven't been to any of these meetings before. This is our work. We did this. If you have a problem with this, you need to come to talk to us. And it really it was really profound for me in that moment, because I saw the value in articulating very clearly how she saw her own ideas and her own input reflected in those drawings enough to stand up in that moment and say something. And that's where the trust comes in, is like we worked iteratively, many, many times to rework the plan to make it in alignment with what they saw. And ultimately that's what you get, hopefully.
They became the champions of their own plan.
Yeah.
And I love that you're telling us all to own it, to have some humility, that we should feel like an outsider, that we should not have automatic trust, that we gain that trust. We invest the time and we work and we gain that trust. We are out of time. And even though my inclination is to want to keep this Zoom going so that we can just have our own private conversation, I won't do that, because who knows what we'll say on YouTube Live. So really, instead, I just want to thank you very much, Sara, Zewde. Thank you so much for being with us here today at K-State at AP Design. You've done an incredible job of not only sharing your work, but of framing this larger significance and why you believe that we can do something good with design, what landscape architecture can be. I think you said it better than I ever could in terms of thinking about the macro reading and bringing it down to the neighborhood, the site scale. So thank you so much. We've been delighted to have you. This has been a great lecture.
Thank you so much. You've been a really wonderful moderator, and thank everyone. I thank everyone for your obviously serious engagement in these issues. I'm so impressed with the questions, and I really wish I could, meet you all and shake your hands. And I'm honored to have been invited, and I thank you so much for having me.
We want to have you back post-COVID to engage with some studios. Okay. Thank you so much, Sara. Bye-bye.
Bye.